Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talking Global Politics with Dr. Detzi and myself, Dr. Kusluch. So, we wanted to make a video thinking about why some issues garner attention, why some issues appear to be national security concerns and worthy of thinking about through this national security lens, while others do not. We all know that there are many important issues occurring around the world today, but we see that some things garner a lot of attention over and over again, while others gain little notice. So, when thinking about global issues in national security, we know that threats are kind of what you make of them, that national security interests are shifting. So there's a few different really good, clear examples of this. One is terrorism, and one is great power competition. So a decade ago, you couldn't open a newspaper, you couldn't turn on the news without hearing discussions about terrorism, the terrorist threat in the US, the terrorist threat around the world. Today, when we look at the data, that the instances of terrorism is just as high as it was a decade ago. But yet, it's not covered nearly as much in the newspaper, by the media, or talked about as much by government officials. Instead, we've seemingly moved more towards great power competition discussions. If we open the New York Times today, we will read stories and see stories about confrontation between the US and Russia or China, or how the Iran conflict is impacting the US Russia competition. And much harder to find stories about terrorism. But again, we know the instances of terrorism around the world remain about what they were a decade ago. So over the weekend, a terrorist attack in Mali garnered a lot of attention. And then since then, I've seen it in multiple podcasts. It's been talked about, I believe, by the New York Times Daily. So it's getting a little bit more attention than over the past several months. So Dan and I thought it would be interesting to just have a conversation, a discussion about maybe why events garner the media attention and the attention from policymakers and those in the administration, while others do not. So we didn't really construct a discussion for today, but instead we just wanted a freewheeling back and forth about maybe some of the concerns we have, some of the instances and issues that we think are worth talking about. So, Dan, I'll let you go first, and then maybe we can poke and prod each other
Yeah.
to
Well,
carry on the conversation.
and just for full disclosure on both of us, like, so Joe, you study, as you mentioned before, great power competition issues. So you're more inclined to look at those. And I look at more
Yeah,
sub-state issues to include counterterrorism and insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. So we come at it from different angles of why it's important or why study it. But both of us, I think, are like, why the shift in attention back and forth? And there's a lot of answers for that, but possible answers. Um, but what I want to talk about too is that I used to study this area in Mali a lot. I actually used to work in the policy realm in Mali and in the Pentagon. So I worked West Africa, the Sahel, North Africa as my portfolio. And that this was, a lifetime ago. It was about 15 years ago. But this was when the Arab Spring was going on, but also when counter we were helping out Mali and the Sahelian states with counterterrorism against some of these groups in that region. Because again, we didn't want it to become another Afghanistan where a group could have a safe haven and then come after U.S. and other interests. Uh, and there was an instance in 2013, I think it was 2013, might have been 2014, where uh, the same instance occurred in Mali. The Tuareg group in the north, which has always rebelled against the government of Mali, teamed up with some of these extremist Islamic groups to drive south, basically, and almost got all the way to the capital of Bamako and maybe on the outskirts. Um, Caused a coup in the country because the military leaders thought the government wasn't paying enough attention. So the coup leaders took over Mali, which was kind of game over for U.S. involvement. But the U.S. had put on a lot of money and effort. We had military trainers there helping the Mali military figure out counterterrorism techniques. But this group that with the and the Tuareg had their own. They want their a separate country for their own in the north called Asawad. But Al Qaeda and the Islamic State kind of clammed onto this, and they went south, captured like Gao and Timbuktu, some of these big trading routes, and that garnered like that was red sirens going off in the office in the Pentagon and from the Obama administration about we need to address this. This is a crisis. It was on the news like almost every day.
Yeah.
And this was at a time when Obama was trying to pivot. Like I think it was earlier on in his administration, he was pivoting to Asia. So we're going away from terrorism, counterterrorism, to pivoting to Asia and confronting China or whatnot. So even in that sense, we got pulled back into the counterterrorism
Yeah.
realm because of this instance in Mali. And we responded to it militarily. We built up small bases there. We upped our funding to some of these governments to build capacity. Fast forward 10, 12 years, same thing happened, but very no response. I haven't seen any response from the U.S. government. I'm sure there's some statement somewhere, but um, of course, granted, the United States is kind of embroiled in this conflict with Iran at the moment. So it's not just the great power competition taking, but it's state on state.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so so that's what interests me. I'm like, okay, why was it an existential threat just 12 years ago, but now it's like, no bother, and I know there's what the certain reasons are, but one of my things, and I'll hand it back over to you, Joe, as I
Yeah.
take the shot across your bow, is that it's easier. I think it's more comfortable for both scholars and or policymakers to think about great power competition because that's kind of the natural state of our foreign policy. Uh, it's much harder to think about these issues like terrorism, which lead lead you as a policymaker or policy regime to think about root causes of terrorism. Why is there terrorism? Well, a lot of it has to do with socioeconomic issues within these countries. It's much harder to go after those. It's much easier to what they call mow the lawn, which I hate that term. Strike these groups, and they use this with Iran as well. Strike them every once in a while to keep their heads low and keep them out of the fray. And then we go back to the big things of confronting China and Russia. But this is stuff, the United States is well versed in because we did it all through the Cold War. And so we tend to always shift from these very complicated things, whether it's counterinsurgency like in Vietnam, to putting that behind us as quickly as possible and moving back to a great power competition mode, only to get pulled back into counterterrorism or counterinsurgency in another uh, part of the world, which is really those are the wars we've had until Iran. These are really the wars that we have fought and not done well in because they're difficult. And policy, counterterrorism policy is a difficult policy because it's not just security writ large. It's more socioeconomic uplift of some of these countries. Whereas great power competition, like I told Joe, and I'll shoot back to him, is the comfort food of foreign policy. It's like, oh, now we can have that mac and cheese, which is the US versus China competition. So I'll throw that back at you.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think if you are a realist scholar, it makes sense to focus on states because states are just what realism looks at, non-state actors, regime types. These are all secondary to states. So I think for realist scholars, it makes sense that we see so much scholarship and so much of the policy focusing on great power competition. Uh, Beyond that, though, I think this is um, an interesting thing that you bring up. That yeah, it we during the Cold War we focused so much on great power competition, and then we started thinking about counterterrorism, and now we're back to it. And I'm not sure why. Maybe it's viewed as a conflict with China is so existential that that's just what we have to focus on. When the Obama administration was arguing that the pivot needed to be towards China, that it's viewed as such a such a big issue that that's just what we have to spend our time on. Maybe the counter to that though is Russia, because even during the pivot, when Obama is talking about pivoting, Russia's like no, we're still here. We still demand your attention. So I'm not sure why the pivot. From a scholarly perspective, I think it makes sense to some scholars. But from a public policy and foreign policy standpoint, I'm not sure why the attention. And it's something that I talked to you off camera about, that I've talked to my students about how issues that 10 years ago seemed dire, and terrorism, and were front and center, but yet today, um, even in the Washington Post article that I referenced, I think it was on like page 3. It was just a small little on the side, but yet these are destabilizing forces in countries that are already struggling for stability.
Yeah. And uh, not to say that, scholars are taking the comfort food, because there is a, scholarship, whether what you're looking at depends, I guess what you pay attention to in the news depends on how you study things. So
Yeah,
states as the primary level of analysis, I think, is perfectly valid. And of course, you're going to look at great power competition or other like conflicts between Iran, the U.S., and with Israel. That's a state-centric view, and I think that's obviously worthy of study. But even in counterterrorism, you can have a state-centric view with regards to the root causes of
yeah.
it. But you're right, yeah. Realist scholars are not going to look at these sub-state, um, non-state actors as something that's going to affect uh, the system, or cause country or states to go into conflict with each other. Policy wise, though, it's interesting because even when after 9/11, the United States policymakers were really they were trying hard to switch it back to state on state. So you had the axis of evil speech from George Bush after the invasion, or after 9/11, saying, okay, these three states are our main axis of evil that are supplying or supporting terrorism, or are state terrorists themselves: North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. And of course, we went on to invade Iraq, and that turned into a counterterrorism. Even though it wasn't a counterterrorism problem, it was after that. So it the United States is policymakers always shift over to this state on state, because that's how our system's set up to, I think. Like our
Okay.
diplomatic system, whether it's the State Department, DoD, set up for these interactions between states, not between state actors. And if you're trying to cooperate with a state, or on terrorism, which usually is what occurs, you're trying to build their capacity to address terrorism. That's, you're addressing state on state. You're not addressing necessarily the terrorist groups themselves. You're never going to have them in peace talks. You're never going to, say, what do you want? ISIS, and give them
Okay, yeah.
their say. So, and even Joe and I, when we were at Midwest, one of the papers was on, was ISIS considered a state, or should have been considered a state?
Yeah.
So again, it's going back to this. We want to deal with states, not with
Yeah.
other groups. So it's always, and that was scholarship, and the scholarship, though, granted, was about why didn't we recognize a state, or the globe recognize it as a state? So
Yeah.
how does the international community recognize terrorist groups, recognize them either as states or as non-state actors. So it's difficult, and that's why I think I'll just sum it up is I think that our system, our foreign policy system, and even our scholarship is really focused in international relations and comparative politics
Yeah.
is set up on looking at states and looking at state. Sure, we look at sub-state level stuff like governance types and things like that. Um, and there obviously there's parts of scholarship that looks at non-state actors, but that's kind of I'm one of those in a sense because I study counterterrorism and counterinsurgencies. That's kind of on the margins
Yeah.
of it, and but I think the system's set up for state on state type of policy making and study.
Yeah, yeah, that's funny. So the semester I teaching comparative politics, intro to comparative politics, like I teach every couple of years. And chapter one, the state, of course. Like it's you're gonna know what a state is and why it's the unit of analysis for much of comparative. And then like chapter 11, I think it was, is like, oh, non-state actors, they do matter. But even how we teach our courses and how our textbooks are laid out pushes this idea of the state is the unit of
Mhm.
analysis, and then we can open up that black box. But first, we need to know what that box looks like.
Yeah.
And so,
And
yeah,
it's,
I think that no, please.
oh, I was gonna say, and it's what's interesting is the shit because I remember after 9/11, counterterrorism was a thing, right? So every uh, office in the US government, every department, every agency had a then created, even though they might have had him before, now it was proliferated, this counterterrorism departments or offices within, uh, say, the Treasury, within State Department, within obviously within DoD, but even outside of those, there's a Center for Counterterrorism created. Department of Homeland Security in part was created because of that. Uh, but everything had a counterterrorism
Yeah,
to its so every interagency meeting you go to, there's going to be a counterterrorism expert in that little framework. I would say that those have disappeared. So again, that was a flavor of the day. That was a threat. You needed experts on it. Same with academia. I think academia at that time in the early 2000s was really looking for scholars who studied, and there were scholars for decades that had studied terrorism and terrorist groups, but they were lifted up into, okay, we
yeah,
need to hire, let's bring in some terrorism experts to get, not only to get some credit saying, hey, we're studying this, so you might get grants or whatnot, but also because of genuine, we need to increase our knowledge on this. And then that went to the policymakers. So I think the same ebb and flow goes with great power competition. It's like now we recognize, yeah, China is now probably going to be a peer competitor.
yeah,
And Russia is also this again has risen up and become prominent. So now we need experts. We kind of did away with our Russian experts, did away with our kind of put the China experts on the periphery, and but then they were brought forward. So you get policy, and I haven't looked at the policy making realm of the interagency, but yeah, there's probably great power competition, little cells that look at the synthesis between all of this, not just separately looking at China, separately looking at Russia, but looking at it
yeah,
all together, which never really happened. You're always kind of siloed into your Russianists, China, Sino experts, but now it's probably melded. And also in academia, you see, job announcements say comparative politics with a focus on Russia or focus on East
yeah,
Asia and China. Not, I haven't seen one in years that said we need a counterterrorism expert or someone that looks at sub non-state actors or things like that. I
yeah,
mean, it comes with it. Like you can study China and say, okay, we're going to look at the Uyghurs and look at this group as a kind of a non-state or at least a separatist type of movement within China, and then that kind of puts you in the counterterrorism or terrorism or counterinsurgency even framework. So, but you see the shift, and
yeah.
I guess the question I asked to you, Joe, is like, when do you see this? Do you ever see this shifting back to any other certain genre that policy is going to take over and scholarship is going to take over?
Oh,
or shift
I
to?
do. Yeah. So, funny antidote there. When I was hired 3 years ago at UNC, I replaced a Russianist, and he moved somewhere out east, and they hired me. And the chair of my department, this was shortly after, well, not shortly, but this was following the full scale invasion, Russia's full scale invasion of Ukraine. And he made a comment to me that if that didn't occur, there was no way they were going to hire another Russianist. So it kept it like in the news and in
Hmm.
demand. And so I think big events like that are what shift our attention. So if we would see the reemergence of maybe a backing away of great power competition, it would be because of highly publicized events in the US. And then I think it could draw attention back to anti-terrorism and counterterrorism movements. Um, I think that's just the ebb and flow of the media cycle. If there were um, well publicized terrorist attacks in the US, then all
Yeah.
of a sudden it would draw the attention, and then academia would follow that. Okay, this is still something that we need to follow more. When we
Mhm.
look at terrorism, and we look at like heat maps, the Council on Foreign Relations has put out heat maps of where terrorism occurs. They're in places like Mali that maybe the average American doesn't think a lot about. Or if you offer courses in North Africa, a lot of students might not sign up for those courses.
Yeah.
And so we see that that's just not where the attention is, but that could shift
Yeah.
if there were, again, if there were events that occur in the
Yeah.
US.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and money is at the heart of a lot of things, resources. So yeah, if the government is sending demand, like the federal government or state governments are sending demand signals, like we want experts in this field, I think the universities and colleges are going to respond to that. Um, the other thing, and this gets a little bit nerdy into like public policy theory and ideas, but how things get on the agenda as national security interests has always been studied. And so this is like the
Yeah.
substate. This is the kind of stuff I geek out on is like how is policy decided on, how decision making. And some of these things like just getting something on the agenda is difficult. So um, you could have you can make just like in state on state. So if within government you make alliances, you have coalitions. If something's really important to say, if you really want to focus on terrorism, counterterrorism, or migration, it takes a lot to get that on the agenda of national security decision makers if it's not like front and center. So
Yeah.
it would take a coalition between politicians, between industry, between academia to say this is something very important we need to look at. And whether that gets on the agenda within the White House's realm of sphere of influence or Congress's, that's another story. One example I think that is still in the background, and I think is getting pushed to get on the agenda as a major policy realm is space. And that's again,
Yeah.
that goes into the great power competition, but there's more to it than just great power competition, I think. But people don't often think of space policy as a vital national interest. But I think the agenda setting groups have gotten that on the agenda because there's uh, national security involved, there's industry involved, there's also scholarship that needs to be done at. There's not much scholarship on, well, there is a lot of scholarship, but not like loads and loads of it on space policy uh, going forward. So that's one of those things, that I get interested in is like, how do things actually get on the agenda? It's not necessarily
Yeah.
just news cycle. There's players behind the scenes that push these up and to get the attention of people. So that's a whole other area of study that I always found interesting, like how things get put on there to be made a national interest, get put into the national security strategy, and then pushed out as a emphasis.
Yeah. It's funny. So at university a few weeks ago when the Artemis 2 was launched, I was showing it to some of my students and during the launch. and there was someone asked like, why are we spending money on this? Or why would we care to spend money
Mhm.
on this? And what emerged in the discussion subsequently was that China is also they just launched a rocket like the day before, that this idea of a re-emerging space race as a national security concern is going to drive. We might think it's neat just to have space exploration for the scientific discovery or to show that we can, but to some policymakers and decision makers, well, that national security concern is going to drive this. Well, if China can do this, could China then take a step for resources or weapons in space? And policymakers all of a sudden care a lot. And it's not just for the coldness of space exploration.
Yeah.
It's
And I always thought this is getting off on a bit of a tangent, but the competition for space wouldn't be to land back at the moon or head to Mars, but these asteroids that have tons and tons of precious metal, like rare earth, they're not on Earth, but rare earth minerals that could, if you had the technology to go, and we do have technology to get to these asteroids. We've already been to them, uh, at least NASA and ESA. Why isn't that the focus of competition? If you think of the surge of competition for resources on Earth itself, rare earth minerals in the great power competition realm, you'd think that that would be the focus of the space race or the of space competition, not and there's stuff on the moon, I believe, that has value that um, but not the type of value that we is going to be brought back to Earth necessarily for
yeah,
so so that's interesting. I'm not a space person as far as policy, but I think that's one of those questions, like when is that going to be the focus?
yeah,
And again, I think it's going to be in the great competition realm, but it's going to be focused on who's going to get to this asteroid we know has a bunch of good stuff in it and be able to bring that, you know, with economic at least efficiency, be able to bring stuff back and make do or even claim this asteroid in the name of, it's probably going to be a private company, but in the name of the
yeah.
United States, this is our huge resource here. There's been sci-fi shows about this forever. What was the name? It was The Expanse was the name of a miniseries
Okay,
that came out. Yeah, it was 2018, 2019, but it's had several series, but it's about this resource competition in space, but it turns into another Cold War in space,
okay,
with even planetary, like there's Mars has become independent and is now fighting for these resources. So it's really interesting because it's a
yeah,
sci-fi movie about a future Earth, but it takes in all these international relations problems or
yeah.
issues that we've had in the past and currently are, and kind of projects it forward to say, okay, this is how it might happen. And I always like, because I'm kind of a sci-fi geek, so I kind of like that
I'll have to
it,
check it out.
yeah, it's a good one. The third season gets a little goofy like most series do, but um, the first couple seasons are really good and kind of go in line with what we're talking about now. This what's
Yeah,
old is new again type of thing, except in a different
yeah.
venue. But I'll bring it back to earth and throw it to you.
I think, unless you have any concluding
Now they're gonna think I'm a
comments,
wacko. They're like, "Why are you just talking about space and asteroids?"
well, we could see that as the next realm of grid power competition because
Yeah.
we already know spaces.
Yeah, but I
So
do I do see, just to bring it back to earth and kind of
yeah,
end my part of the conversation of non-state actors. I think, we ignore non-state actors to our risk, to our detriment. And I think there is going to be another sizable attack in either Europe or the United States that will shift again our
yeah,
attention to some of these areas. And I'm not quite sure um, where that's going to be or how, but I think that's when the attention is going to shift back. And so it's going to be this
yeah,
constant kind of um, sine wave of going back and forth to state on state to now non-state actors, which going after non-state actors does create competition or cooperation with some of these great powers, like the piracy off of the Somali coast saw the United States and China working together in fleets to counter piracy. So it's kind of an interesting thing to unifying kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or vice versa in this case. So
Or just creates more confrontation if we see another great power supporting the
yeah,
non-state actors, which could
well, that's
also
the
be a
yeah,
thing.
and that
Yeah,
that was the justificate one of the justifications for going to war with Iran is that they supported these proxy groups
yeah.
like Hezbollah, which is a known uh, bad actor as far as terrorism in the region. Um, Same with Hamas. So we use that as a reason to go after the regime in Iran. So same with North Korea. North Korea has been pitted as that. Cuba was named a so I wouldn't be surprised if we see that brought up if something happens to Cuba. Hey, they support terrorism in the Western Hemisphere or something like that. So yeah, terrorism is used as a reason to go after other countries as well.
Well, with that, back on Earth, I thank you for your time today, Dan.
This series
And
is
we will.
canceled.
This series is canceled, and we will see you all next week.